The Supreme Court has spoken very loudly on this in Youngstown Steel versus Truman in 1952. So there are three types of executive orders. One where the president furthers the will of Congress, and it's very clear. One in which the president does something that it's unclear because Congress hasn't acted on it. But then a third category, which is a very worrisome category, and that's when the president acts against the will of Congress. That's what my fear is here, and that there is a real danger to running your government, by emergency. And so I will vote for the motion to disapprove of this, and I will continue to speak out. I do believe that there is at least 10 Republican no votes. We'll see, possibly more. My reason for speaking out now is that I think we all need to think this through before we get too far down the road. As far as other ways that we could fund the wall, we're proposing legislation that we're putting in today to add a surcharge to those who come to our country of $2,500, and that surcharge would actually bring in about $2.5 billion a year. It would have to be passed by Congress, but it's a proposal where actually it would be those who are coming to our country who would pay for border security. When I talk to many immigrants from the Indian American community, the Chinese American community, Filipino American community, they're willing to pay a fee. They want to come to America, they really want to be here. And I think it would be a way of actually doing this where we're not taking it out of the general treasury, but we're actually bringing in a new fee that would actually help pay for border security. With that, why don't we do some questions?
Senator Paul, can you expand a little bit on your comment about Youngstown Steel, especially the third area? You said we're going over the will of Congress. So when you talk to some of your Republican colleagues, do you think, though, that they supersede this? They see this in a different framework than if they were dealing with President Obama?
I think virtually everybody in our caucus is troubled by this. Even when you hear Republicans say they're going to support this, they're troubled by the president, and they're troubled by the fact that this is executive power that's being expanded. I think when you look at the Youngstown Steel case, this really, I think, is going to be applicable, and I think there's a very good chance that the Supreme Court will strike this down.
Senator Paul, did you speak to the president about your decision?
Yeah, I spoke to the president last night, and we had a good discussion. He says he understands where I'm coming from, and he didn't tell me we would never play golf again. So I think we're okay, but no, it's one of those things. I just believe very strongly in this separation of powers, that no matter who's the president. I mean, I must have said 1,000 times that President Obama was acting like a king. But I will say one thing, and this is where I think the media deserves a little bit of circumspection as to hypocrisy. Everybody's looking for Republicans to be hypocritical. What about the fact that there was not one Democrat who said President Obama had usurped his authority in doing the immigration thing? So everyone wants Republicans now to be consistent on this, but it was the Democrats. Not one Democrat stood up and said President Obama was using power that wasn't given to him. So now everybody's expecting Republicans to be consistent, and I wish we were, but really hypocrisy is on both sides of the aisle here. The Democrats are out in full force on this because it's a Republican president, but not one of them stood up to their own president. It is more difficult when the president's from your party, but really this should be about congressional power versus presidential power, checks and balances, and not letting too much power accumulate in one place.
Senator Paul, would you say that President Trump is acting like a king with this declaration?
I think that he believes that he's doing what's right for the country. I actually support the policy. I think the idea that, and this is what many say, and this is what some of my colleagues, getting back to your question on this, many of them will say, well, there is a statute. There is this emergency statute. But really, the Constitution takes precedent over any statute. So there's a question, are they adhering to the statute? If you look just at the letters of the statute, I think it's debatable whether this actually adheres to an actual law. The problem is that the general principle of the Constitution was Congress would spend the money, and the President was never allowed to spend the money without the approval of Congress. The President's not allowed to write executive orders that are against the will of Congress, which this appears to be. So I would say that many of them are sort of looking to the emergency statute and say, well, he's adhering to the statute. I think we really should look at the emergency statute. There's like 130 different emergencies you can declare. Some of them have gone on for 30 or 40 years. I think it's a mistake to run government. And if you look at the history of not only our government, but the history of other governments around the world, governments that begin to begin to be run by emergencies, really bad things can happen. So I think it's important, even though I trust this president and I'm supportive, I worry about who the next president is and the next president and the next president. It isn't about President Trump, it's about the division of power for me.
Senator, what other issues are you prepared to separate on the president on? Could we see you be more vocal about Venezuela in the coming days?
About the what?
About Venezuela in the coming days and weeks.
You know, it's not like I sat up one day and said, where do I want to separate myself from President Trump? You know, there are political risks to separate yourself from your own party's president. I feel very strongly about this. I feel very strongly about the separation of powers. I did under President Obama, and I have exactly the same feeling now. And to me, it isn't even about immigration. It isn't about a Republican or a Democrat president. It's about Congress versus the president and where the power should be distributed. I don't have some plan to separate myself. You know, look, I've been against the Attorney General. I was the only Republican, so I haven't been afraid to stand up and part ways. But I've also been very supportive. I think, frankly, most of the, I want to say garbage, but I shouldn't say it. Most of the stuff on the Russian investigation has been completely partisan. What the House is doing now is all completely partisan. All the stuff they're wanting to do to President Trump, I will continue to stand up and defend him on that because I think that is partisan. When it comes to something that I feel is a constitutional separation of powers, I'll be where I've always been.
Senator, are there any assurances you could get from the president that would make you change your mind, that would make you not vote for this resolution, this to terminate the...
You know, my only suggestion to make this a better situation where all Republicans can come together, when we put money out there, there are some rules that let money be reprogrammed and moved around. Most people aren't really actually arguing. There's actually a significant amount of money that has been for drug interdiction or this and that really people aren't saying, well, that's unconstitutional. They've made it fuzzy exactly how the money can be spent, and he can move some of that around. Probably a significant amount. Senator Alexander thinks it's as much maybe as he needs, or says he wants. The real danger is in this Emergency Act, because now we're talking about spending money that was actually assigned specifically for something else, and then spending it on the wall. Maybe one or two more.
If the president vetoes this resolution, as he's indicated he will you vote to override his veto?
Yes.
And would you consider your colleagues who are constitutionalists like you, who believe in the separation of powers, would you push those who say that they're going to side with the president now to push for either a veto override or to vote for the resolution now?
Well, my hope in coming out now is that there'll be a more full debate, and that there will be a few others. By my count, I've had at least 10 people coming up to me saying that they will vote to disapprove on this. I'm not going to name them, they got to name themselves. But I think there's more than people think. And I think if we got 60 or above 60, then you're only talking about a few votes as to whether this would happen. My preference would be to count the votes, and if we could actually be even better. If some people don't want to be public and we could count to 67, maybe someone could make a phone call to the White House and say, maybe we should look at a different way and don't put the Republicans through this difficulty of voting for this. For some people, it's a difficult vote. And so maybe we could ask them to retract the emergency order.
You think 67 is possible?
Probably not. but I do think that, like I say, 10 gets you to 57. I think high 50s to 60 is possible. And maybe as we had a more full debate here, or if someone from our leadership would offer to take the message back to the White House and say, why don't you reprogram some of the money that you're allowed to reprogram, and then maybe we wouldn't have to do this thing that, you know, you've seen, even the Republican defenders of this all say they're uncomfortable with it. John?
Just you mentioned the partisan, your colleagues in the House being partisan. Mr. Nadler has asked, I think, issued 81 subpoenas of the president. That seems like an awfully big number. Your thoughts?
I think that the president's been saying for a long time it's a witch hunt. Now it really is a witch hunt in the House. In the House before there was some balance to it. And Republicans, look, Republicans in the House and the Senate, even though they, I don't think, believe that the president did anything wrong, did investigate this. Look, our intelligence committee here did hours and hours and had a fairly bipartisan investigation. And the conclusion was finally that there was no evidence of collusion. Now I think it's becoming bitter partisanship, asking for the president's tax returns. Look, the president said he wasn't giving your tax returns, and the country voted for it. You know, couldn't have been more public. And so I think it's, they may bite off more than they intended. There's a possibility there's going to be a backlash. the same way that things have become so extreme with the new Green Deal and some of these things, that I think there is a possibility that it actually makes the president stronger if they go too far.
Senator Paul, are you interested in potentially revisiting the National Emergencies Act itself, and is that something that's being discussed amongst yourself and colleagues?
The act itself?
Yeah.
Yeah. The main problem with the National Emergency Act is, one, presidents just renew it ad infinitum for decades. That's one problem. But the even bigger problem is that the president gets to announce it, and it can only be taken down by disapproval. And if the president vetoes it, because the president's obviously for it, if he created, said there's an emergency, that means 1/3 of Congress has to sustain a veto, just over 1/3 plus one vote rules the place. And that's really not what I think people intended by this. Most things should have to be affirmatively approved. So there is discussion, and there have been some resolutions put forward that would be to change this from a vote of disapproval to a vote of approval. So if the president puts forward an emergency, it lasts for 30 days and then has to be affirmatively approved. I mean, most of us think it would be emergency if there's a television show with a State of the Union, everything blows up and everybody dies. That would be an emergency. People incapacitated by anthrax, that's an emergency. But wanting to fund something that Congress wouldn't give you the money for, I think it really doesn't. This is a long-standing problem. And people say, well, you're saying there's no emergency. No, I think there is a problem with the border. But we have to do it in a way that's consistent with the Constitution.
Senator,
Last
can you say
question,
anything else about President Trump's reaction in your conversation yesterday, or did he indicate that he may not go ahead with the national emergency?
No, not at all. I think he's made his decision. I think his decision will continue short of something changing. And we had a good discussion. We always do. And I think he understands and tells me that, look, he understands where I'm coming from, and it's just a point of view. And doesn't mean I won't continue to be one of his biggest supporters on many issues. Thanks,
Thank you,
everybody.
guys.
Thank you.